Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to kick off today's presentation on understanding active and passive voice. The title of our talk is exactly that, Understanding Active and Passive Voice, and we'll also explore some key concepts along the way. In this session, we'll look at what active and passive voice are, how to identify them, and when to use each one effectively. So, let's get started and dive into the world of voice in English grammar. Let's take a quick look at the contents of today's presentation. We're going to start by exploring the relationship between verbs and voice. Then, we'll dive into active voice and compare it with passive voice to understand when and why to use each one. We'll look at some examples of passive voice and discuss the forms of passive verbs. We'll also cover reasons to favor active voice in your writing. Later, we'll see how to transform passive sentences into active ones and practice applying these concepts ourselves. This overview helps us see how all these parts fit together to improve our writing clarity and style. Now, let's talk about verbs and voice. Voice is essentially the form a verb takes to show us whether the subject of the sentence is doing something or receiving something. It's a key part of understanding how sentences are constructed. There are two main types of voice: active voice and passive voice. In active voice, the subject performs the action, making sentences more direct and lively. In passive voice, the subject receives the action, which can sometimes make sentences sound more formal or focus on the action itself rather than who's doing it. Recognizing these voices helps us better understand and craft clear, effective sentences, which ties back to our overall goal of improving communication. Let's talk about active voice. Active voice is when the subject of the sentence is actually doing the action. So, in these sentences, the subject acts upon the verb, which makes the sentence clear and direct. Because of this, we say that these sentences are in the active voice. Using active voice helps make your writing more engaging and easier to understand. It puts the focus on who is doing the action, which makes your message more straightforward. In the context of effective communication, whether in writing or speaking, active voice is often preferred because it makes your message clearer and more lively. Throughout this presentation, you'll see how choosing active voice can strengthen your communication skills and help you connect better with your audience. Now, let's take a look at some examples of active voice. These examples clearly show that the subject is performing the action of the verb. For instance, in the sentence, "The dog jumped onto the boy," the dog is the subject, and it is doing the jumping, that's the action. Similarly, in "Christy will give a book report to the class," Christy is the one doing the giving. She is actively performing that action. And even in the more unusual example, "The computer ate my paper," the computer is the subject, and it's doing the eating. What's important to notice here is that active voice makes sentences clearer and more direct. It highlights who is doing what, which keeps your writing lively and engaging. This focus on the subject performing the action ties into our overall theme of effective communication. When you use active voice, your message becomes more straightforward and easier for your audience to understand. Now let's talk about passive voice. In a passive voice sentence, the roles of the subject and object switch places. The subject becomes the receiver of the action rather than the doer. For example, instead of saying, "The chef cooked the meal," in passive voice, it becomes, "The meal was cooked by the chef." The key idea here is that the subject is acted upon, which is why we call these sentences passive. This concept is important because understanding passive voice helps us recognize different sentence structures and communicate more clearly. It also ties into our overall theme of mastering effective communication. Knowing when and how to use active or passive voice can make your writing more precise and engaging. Now, let's take a closer look at some examples of passive voice. These examples demonstrate how the subject of the sentence is being acted upon by the verb. For instance, in the first example, "A book report will be given by Christy to the class." Here, the focus is on the report, which is the subject, and the action of giving is being performed by Christy. Notice that the sentence emphasizes the report itself, not Christy. In the second example, "The boy was jumped on by the dog," The subject is the boy, and the action is being jumped on. The emphasis is on what is happening to the boy, not the dog performing the action. Moving to the third example, my paper was eaten by the computer. The paper is the subject, and the action of eating is being done by the computer. Finally, the fourth example, though not fully shown here, would similarly highlight how the subject is receiving the action. The key takeaway is that passive voice shifts the focus from the doer of the action to the recipient of the action. This can be useful in certain contexts, especially when the doer is unknown or less important than the action itself. Understanding this helps us see how passive voice can impact the clarity and tone of our writing, which ties back to our overall theme of effective communication. Let's talk about why most writers prefer to use the active voice. It's simply more direct and engaging. When you use the active voice, your sentences tend to be clearer and less awkward. For example, compare "the waiter dropped the tray of food" with "the tray of food was dropped by the waiter." The first sentence feels more natural and straightforward. It clearly shows who is doing what. Now look at another example. "Your request for funding has been denied by the review committee" versus "the review committee denied your request for funding." The active version immediately tells us who took the action, making it more concise and impactful. Using the active voice helps propel your reader forward through your writing. It avoids weak, passive constructions that can slow down the flow of your message. So overall, choosing the active voice makes your writing more direct, clearer, and more engaging, key qualities when communicating effectively. This ties into our overall theme of crafting compelling and clear messages. Now let's talk about when to use passive voice. In general, passive voice tends to be less direct, less forceful, and less concise than active voice. That's why it's often used sparingly. However, there are specific situations where it can be quite effective. First, you might use passive voice when you don't know who performed the action, or when you prefer not to reveal that information. For example, if the performer is unknown or irrelevant, passive constructions keep the focus elsewhere. Second, passive voice is useful when you want to emphasize the receiver of an action rather than the doer. For instance, if the impact on someone or something is more important than who caused it, passive voice helps highlight that. Connecting this to our overall theme, understanding the appropriate context for passive voice allows us to craft clearer, more intentional messages. It's a tool. Used wisely, it can serve your communication goals effectively. Let's look at some examples of passive voice. First, we have the awkward passive. "My bicycle was repainted by John." This construction can feel a bit clunky or unnecessary because it emphasizes the action and the doer, but in many cases, it's more natural to focus on the object or the result. Next, there's the deliberate passive. "My bicycle was repainted." Here, notice that the performer, John, is no longer mentioned. The focus shifts entirely to the bicycle itself. This style is often used when the person performing the action isn't important or when we want to highlight the object rather than the subject. Understanding these differences helps us see how passive voice can be used intentionally to shape the emphasis in our sentences, which ties into our overall theme of effective communication. All right, let's talk about the form of passive voice verbs. The key thing to remember is that passive voice always involves what we call a double verb. This means you'll see a form of the verb to be combined with the past participle of another verb. Usually, this past participle ends in n, ed, or t. For example, in the active voice, we might say, "John baked the bread." When we switch to passive voice, it becomes, "The bread was baked by John." Notice here that "was" is a form of to be, and "baked" is the past participle. This structure is fundamental because it helps us understand how to form passive sentences correctly. It also connects to the overall theme of how we can shift focus from the doer of the action to the receiver of the action in our sentences. Let's talk about the forms of to be. Writers should be familiar with these because they're often called linking verbs. Knowing these helps you easily identify the passive voice in your writing. The key forms of to be include am, is, are, was, were, be, being, and been. Each of these plays a crucial role in sentence structure. For example, am, is, and are present tense forms, while was and were are past tense. The forms be, being, and been are used in different grammatical contexts, like infinitives, continuous tenses, or perfect tenses. Recognizing these forms will help you see where the passive voice might be used and improve your overall writing clarity. Remember, understanding these linking verbs is a vital step in mastering effective writing and making your message clear. Let's take a closer look at these examples of to be in the passive voice. What's interesting here is how the form of to be changes depending on the tense and the context. For instance, is kicked is in the present simple, while was kicked shows the past simple. Moving on, had been kicked is past perfect, indicating something happened before another past action. Then we have is being kicked, which is present continuous, showing an ongoing action right now. We also see future forms like will be kicked and going to be kicked, which express future intentions or plans. Modal verbs come into play with can be kicked and should be kicked, indicating possibility or recommendation. The perfect continuous aspect appears with has been kicked and was being kicked, highlighting the ongoing nature of the action at specific times. All these variations are crucial because they show how flexible and nuanced the passive voice can be in English. Understanding these forms helps us better grasp the overall theme of tense, aspect, and voice, which is essential for mastering communication in different contexts. Let's talk about transforming passive to active voice. Often, when we look at passive sentences, you'll notice they include a by phrase. This phrase indicates who or what performed the action. The key to making these sentences more direct and engaging is to move that object, what comes after the by, to the subject position at the beginning of the sentence. By doing this, we turn a passive sentence into an active one, which usually makes our writing clearer and more dynamic. This simple change helps us communicate more effectively, especially when we're trying to emphasize the doer of the action. Remember, this technique is a powerful tool in our writing toolkit, aligning with the overall goal of making our messages more compelling and easier to understand. Now let's look at some examples of transformation, specifically focusing on passive and active voice. First, we have the sentence, the cookies were eaten by the children. Here, the focus is on the cookies and the action is performed by the children. Notice how the subject receives the action, which is typical of passive voice. Moving to the second example, the tunnels are dug by the gophers. Again, the emphasis is on the tunnels, with the gophers performing the action. On the other hand, the active voice examples are more straightforward and direct. The children ate the cookies clearly states who is doing the action, the children, and what they did, the eating. Similarly, the gophers dug the tunnels puts the gophers front and center as the doers of the action. These examples highlight the key difference. Passive voice often shifts the focus to the receiver of the action, while active voice emphasizes the doer. Understanding when and how to use each can help clarify your writing and make your communication more effective, which is essential as we explore different ways to craft clear, engaging language throughout this presentation. All right, now let's move on to some practical application. In this exercise, we're asked to change these sentences from passive voice to active voice. The goal here is to understand how to identify the subject performing the action and rephrase the sentence accordingly. For example, the first sentence is, the statue is being visited by hundreds of tourists every year. To make it active, we want to bring the tourists to the front as the doers. It becomes, hundreds of tourists visit the statue every year. Similarly, for my books were stolen by someone yesterday, we change it to someone stole my books yesterday. Next, these books had been left in the classroom by a careless student, becomes, a careless student left these books in the classroom. For coffee is raised in many parts of Hawaii by plantation workers. We switch it to plantation workers grow coffee in many parts of Hawaii. And finally, the house had been broken into by someone while the owners were on vacation. Turns into, someone broke into the house while the owners were on vacation. The key point here is that active voice emphasizes the doer of the action, making sentences clearer and more direct. This exercise ties into our overall theme of effective communication. Using the active voice often makes our writing and speaking more engaging and easier to understand. All right, now let's move on to some practice. I'll give you a few sentences, and your task is to change them into the passive voice. This is a great way to solidify your understanding of how active and passive sentences work together. First, we have children cannot open these bottles easily. When we turn this into the passive voice, it becomes, these bottles cannot be opened easily by children. Notice how the focus shifts from the children doing the action to the bottles receiving the action. Next, the government built a road right outside her front door. In passive voice, it becomes, a road was built right outside her front door by the government. Again, we're emphasizing the object, the road, and the action done to it. Then, Mr. Ross broke the antique vase as he walked through the store. This turns into, the antique vase was broken by Mr. Ross as he walked through the store. It's a little longer, but it clearly shows the object receiving the action. Moving on to, when she arrived, the changes amazed her. In passive, this becomes, she was amazed by the changes when she arrived. Here, the focus is on her being amazed. Finally, the construction workers are making street repairs all month long. In passive voice, its street repairs are being made by the construction workers all month long. Remember, practicing these conversions helps improve your understanding of sentence structure and enhances your ability to communicate in different contexts. Keep practicing, and you'll master the passive voice in no time.